or sorry, not Q&A, it's our live stream lecture where we will be discussing a particular historical topic. Today we've got a special one for you to make up for missing last week's. I will be doing two topics. I don't know if it's going to go 2 hours or not, but we will be discussing two different historical topics that you voted on, the top two that people voted for here on YouTube. We always choose the most popular, but because we're doing two, we chose the top two popular ones, and you can vote every week on the live stream lecture topic you would like to see. So please check and wait for that post. Usually comes about Friday or Saturday, and you get to vote on what I will be discussing the next day or the day after that Sunday. We have live streams every Friday and Saturday, our Q&As at 6 and 3 p.m. respectively. And of course, we have our short form and long form content available for you, as well as all of our lives here on YouTube. So please check that out and become a friendly neighborhood historian by liking and subscribing. Double tap that screen. It really, really helps out a lot. So I would appreciate it if you do. Hopefully my audio and visual is coming in and there's no terrible lag. So without further ado, we'll get started. The two topics that you voted on and chose were nationalism in the 19th century in Europe and the American founding. Excuse me. So I will be discussing both of those topics today during the live stream. Hopefully you all really enjoy it. Yeah, and we'll see. I don't know if that'll take the full 2 hours or not. I don't know if that'll take just an hour, but there's a lot to discuss and a lot to unpack. But I hope you all really enjoy it. I won't be interacting with the chat as much, so if you come with questions or topics you'd like to discuss, you're going to have to wait. I don't know if we'll have time for Q&A afterwards, but we do have our live stream lecture as we do every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And again, we are discussing the nationalism in the 20th century. And since you can't really, or 19th century, since you can't really see it, this is a map, or a painting of Germans holding up a German flag in the 19th century that kind of illustrates the rising nationalist movement that was extraordinarily popular in Germany and most of the rest of the European continent in the 19th century. And so we'll be discussing how nationalism changed Europe in the 1800s, where it came from, what it meant, what is nationalism, how do we understand nationalism, and its impact on the development of European society in the 1800s. So if that or any historical topic in general tends to interest you, I suggest you like and subscribe. So nationalism is the idea. There are two forms of nationalism that we really actually need to address. There is a nationalism that we deal with today and talk about politically with a lot of negative connotations, mainly because of the Nazis, mainly because of things along that nature. And then there is a nationalism that we discuss that has a more historical ring to it. Basically, nationalism as an idea that emerged in the 1800s was the principle or the concept that people of a certain area should be able to create their own nation based on a shared culture, language, and history. And they should be able to have a nation to themselves. It's closely connected with the democratization idea of self-determination. Again, this is all political philosophical language that basically means that people should be able to determine the direction of their own country and have a country that represents their ethnic makeup and their cultural background. The pride in one's ethnic background, one's cultural background, one's historical shared common history and culture is nationalism. So it is another form of patriotism that tends to believe that something about your nation makes your nation better than other nations. The modern political form of nationalism, which has gotten a lot of criticism, is basically believing that your society is better than any other society. We have become a very multicultural, global, interconnected, intercontinental world in the last century. So nationalism has become very unpopular in a lot of circles because people see it as chauvinistic, imperialistic, as a justification for all sorts of atrocities and oppressions against people who do not share that culture. If you're saying that your nation is better and your society is better than someone else's and you deserve to share that culture with people who look and act like you, then you are excluding those who are not like you, and you are also saying at the same time that other civilizations and cultures are not as that are not equal to you and have some sort of inferiority compared to yours that you don't necessarily want to say. So the chauvinistic imperialist side of it, mixed with the legacy of fascism, which is an extreme form of nationalism, and Nazism in the 20th century, has led nationalism to becoming quite unpopular in the recent decades. Ever since the end of the last World War, the idea of supranationalism, the world being interconnected, different, and working together to achieve peace and prosperity for all, has become far more popular than individualistic nationalism, which many people believe only can result in things like the Nazis and stuff of that nature. So welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, and this is our live stream lecture. We are talking about European nationalism in the 1800s and how it formed the modern states of Europe, and then we are also going to be discussing the founding of America, a topic I have discussed before, but I'm going to be looking at it instead of a military revolutionary side, I'm going to be looking at it as a political thing instead. So this is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. We're not doing our usual Q&A, so I won't be interacting with the chat as much as I normally do, but I am here to answer, but I may be able to do that after the live stream is over. So thank you all for joining us. We really hope you're enjoying your Sunday, and we appreciate you choosing to spend part of your weekend with us, and like and subscribe for much, much more content. So anyways, the thing I was going to say next that does the thing I was going to say next, when does nationalism really get going? Well, the idea of pride in one's country and believing that your country is great and wonderful has existed probably for all of human history. Believing your society and civilization is inherently superior to another one's was the justification for the conquest of every great major empire and civilization in the ancient and medieval world. The Romans certainly had a form of nationalism that saw themselves as militarily, culturally, and ethnically superior to those whom they conquered and constantly fought against. So this isn't something that just emerged overnight and came out of nowhere. This was something that was this was something that was kind of a latent idea. It wasn't well defined, but it kind of presupposes a lot of the actions of different empires and kingdoms all throughout the medieval world, not just in Europe, but in Asia as well, believing in the superiority of your nation and the superiority of your military power was something that was pretty much a guaranteed in your empires. In fact, kingdoms and empires, unlike modern countries, oftentimes did not use justification to conquer and expand their holdings and control. This is something that is, again, a relatively modern idea. You don't need to necessarily justify it. Sometimes you would and sometimes you wouldn't. If you found a good reason to go to war because you needed land or a particular resource or wanted more manpower, you would find a quick excuse or none at all and go to war. It was that simple. You wanted land and you wanted territory, so you would take it. You would see a perceived wrong as the ultimate justification for any sort of military execution. Nowadays, everybody has to make darn sure that they're going to be doing absolutely the right thing if they go to war. It wasn't necessarily the case 1,000, 1,500 years ago, as is you probably can imagine if you understand anything about history. Things were very different in the past than they are today. So nationalism is kind of a latent idea, I think, that is stitched across the historical timeline with various different peoples believing their countries or groups were superior to others. However, it's hard to talk about the nationalism of individual countries and nations when you have large empires that control what are today dozens of nations. So nationalism would have been pride in your civilization. It would have been pride in your empire, perhaps even pride in a particular ethnic group within your empire. So it's a very, very different reality than the nationalism we think of today as being an individual country. So the way nationalism really gets started in our understanding of it historically in Europe in the 19th century is because of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon is probably the greatest general of all time. He's the French emperor. He's the leader of the French. He basically ends the French Revolution and declares himself the ultimate culmination of that revolution, and then uses his military prowess and might to basically justify expansion all throughout Europe, spreading French ideas, the ideas of the revolution, French culture, and French, basically a nationalist message of French superiority all throughout the continent as he takes over and influences large areas. He puts three of his brothers in charge of the Netherlands, Italy, and Spain. And so Napoleon, through these conquests and through these military campaigns, is extraordinarily successful, but he breeds a lot of resentment with the Europeans, who basically hate the fact that they are under French domination by a French imperialist who is trying to control them. This leads to the coalition armies, of which there are about 7, which all try to fight Napoleon over and over and over again. They usually lose, but the last 2 are successful in banishing him the first time and then defeating him finally at Waterloo in 1815 to make sure he is banished completely. In the wake of this, the peoples of the areas that Napoleon had conquered and dominated, in order to resist French occupation and influence that was perpetuated by Napoleon, they do they do everything they possibly can to resist French occupation, French chauvinism, French imperialism, and in order to do this, they come up with the idea of a lot of them start to look inward. They start looking towards their shared culture and ideas as a way to unify them against French influence and principles. This is particularly popular in 2 European areas that have not been the countries they are today. The Germanic peoples had not been a country for basically 1,000 years. There was no Germany in the 1800s. There had been no Germany in the 1500s. What had been the Holy Roman Empire was dismantled by Napoleon and then kind of replaced by the Confederation of the Rhine, which was a French puppet state during Napoleon's tenure, which basically promulgated the ideas of the French Revolution and French chauvinism. The resistance to this organization by the various different Germanic peoples grew, and being German meant you spoke the same language, had the same culture, and shared the same religion. Sometimes there were Lutherans and Catholics all throughout Germany at this time. But the truth of the matter is, you have the development of a German culture and national identity in resistance to French occupation. The Spanish go through something very similar during the Peninsular War, when Napoleon tries to force the Spanish under the control of his brother Joseph. The Spanish resistance to this leads to a civil war in Spain and in Portugal that will eventually see Napoleon and his brother being defeated, and those areas going back to their rightful rulers. This, however, does not stop the nationalist movements in Central and South America, which were inspired by the American Revolutionary Movement, which I'll talk about later, from demanding their own freedom, their own sovereignty on the grounds of nationalism. So ironically, despite the Europeans and the Spanish in particular and their efforts to use their own cultural identity as a staging ground to resist French occupation and influence, they have their own colonies, which they have occupied for centuries, which will now use their own identities to resist them and revolt against them. And by 1821, most of Spain's empire will have fallen apart as nationalism sweeps through Central and South America with people like Jose de San Martin and, of course, Simón Bolívar. Mexico will gain its independence, for instance, in 1821, Venezuela the same year. Portugal will let go of Brazil because the Brazilians are sick and tired of being ruled by the Portuguese in 1822. So while nationalism was a calling card for the Europeans to resist Napoleon and the influence of the French, it is also a calling card for European colonies to gain their own freedom from their European overlords, who were, just a minute ago, resisting Napoleon. So it's a very interesting flip of the switch. So there's 3 case studies that I really want to look at in detail when discussing nationalism in Europe during this time: Italy, Germany, and Greece. Now, the first 2 are probably more well-known stories, and if you know anything about European history in the 1800s, then you know about what happens there. Greece is a little less well-known, but I'm going to discuss them first because they actually are the ones that come about first. The other 2 Greece has its own story that actually isn't related to Napoleon at all. Spain, Italy, and Germany are perhaps their nationalist movements are a direct result of Napoleon, of what Napoleon did in Europe and his efforts to try to control the continent. Napoleon had created an entire economic, political, and military system that had basically paid reverence to the French, and the other European powers were absolutely sick and tired of this. These resistances had led to their own nationalist movements, as nationalism became a way for them to bind themselves together in order to resist Bonaparte. However, the other ideas of the French Revolution were also rising in popularity, such as liberalism and even socialism. These things start to creep in as well. And by liberalism, I don't mean left-wing politics. I mean what we would call classical liberalism, the ideas of democratic government, getting rid of the monarchy or a constitutional monarchy, limiting the power of ruling class, of the aristocracy, free, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, toleration, emancipation, universal suffrage, more political opportunities, educational opportunities for women. These were all Enlightenment theories and ideas that became more and more influential as the French Revolution spread, usually by the force and power of Napoleon, a dictator no less, and his might throughout Europe. So you have liberalism, you have anarchy, you have socialism, and you have nationalism, all developing in the European political culture and climate, especially amongst the upper classes and those who are educated in the 19th century. And they are ironically brought to you by a Frenchman who was a despot who still tried to hold on to revolutionary ideas and principles. Napoleon believed himself to be the fulfillment of the French Revolution and believed the revolution to have been an absolute success in bringing liberty, equality, and fraternity because it had brought him. This is a man who did not operate under those principles at all, however, believed that he was the ultimate vanguard for them. He's a very ironically complex and paradoxical figure when it comes to his political philosophy. But the ideas of nationalism, the ideas of liberalism, the ideas of democracy had become more and more popular throughout Europe, and they would influence politics for the rest of the century. The Greeks, however, had their own story, their own claim to wanting independence, to wanting freedom, and this was because they had been dominated for centuries by the mighty Ottoman Empire. The Greeks had basically, ever since the fall of the Byzantine Empire in the 15th century, Greece had been dominated by the Ottomans. The Ottomans had created a very powerful society. They were very wealthy, and they were actually relatively tolerant and accepting of people with different lifestyles, religious beliefs, and cultures. However, they were not perfect, they were not egalitarian, and they were and despite being cosmopolitan, they were not necessarily multicultural agnostics who believed that everybody was basically equal or the same. Religious minorities in the empire, the largest one being the Christians, were often mistreated unless they either converted to Islam or served in the Ottoman military, particularly as part of the Janissaries. The persecution, there wasn't heavy, widespread persecution or forced conversion of the Christians and other religious groups living within the empire, but in the Balkans, Southeast Europe, and Greece especially, cultural, religious, and political resistance to the Ottomans was always would always be available, could always be found. So they had, what was I going to say? Because of this, the Greeks had resisted the Ottomans implicitly and tacitly for centuries, and as the centuries went on and the Ottoman Empire started to fall, this resistance to the Ottomans, despite pretty decent treatment by an empire of a different ethnic and religious background, by all standards, especially proportional to their time, the Ottomans were an extraordinarily tolerant empire, but that didn't mean that they treated Christians or non-Muslims or Slavic peoples or Greeks as equals. They saw them as inferior, and they treated them very much as second-class citizens would be treated in an empire that is dominated by Turkish Muslims. In fact, the Ottomans also did this to their Muslim populations in the Middle East, creating a lot of resentment between the Arabs, for instance, and the Turks. With the Turks controlling Mecca, they believed themselves to be a caliphate, the rightful successors of Muhammad, and they believed because they were Sunni Muslims, that justified them dominating ethnically and religiously all areas of life for other Muslims who were not ethnically Turkish. So the Turkish superiority of the Ottomans, their mistreatment of the Christians, and things like this spurred on resentments that led to nationalist movements like Muhammad Ali's in Egypt. Yes, not the boxer Muhammad Ali, but the namesake is because of the original Muhammad Ali who led a resistance in Egypt to the Ottomans. The other resistance, of course, being in Greece, had been lasting for quite some centuries and was aided by the Austrians, especially during the 16th and 17th century when war between the Ottomans and the Austrians over dominance in Central and Southeastern Europe was extraordinarily important. The Holy League, started by the Habsburg Austrians, was an organization with the help of the Pope, was seeking to build up as much military resistance to the Ottomans as possible in the Mediterranean, and they had had several important victories, such as at Vienna in 1586, and of course the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. One of these military campaigns includes the Christians storing a bunch of weapons within the Parthenon, and the Ottomans targeting it, believing that it would never be used, that they would never allow. The Ottomans took a bunch of weapons and stored them in the Parthenon, the ancient Greek temple, and believed that the Greeks would never blow up their own temple to spurn the Ottomans. The Greeks blew up their own temple, probably the most famous building in all of ancient Greece, in order to spurn the Ottomans. So hatred of the Ottomans was very high, resistance to them was at least always tacitly around, and then it grew exponentially as time went on. So by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is seriously in decline. It has been hampered, also fighting in the Napoleonic Wars for a short time, and is clearly not the empire that it used to be. And there is weakness, and there is a peeling of the paint, so as it were, in southeastern Europe that allows different groups, all with the idea of nationalism in their mind, which again, nationalism relies on a shared culture, shared language, shared experiences, shared history. The Greeks among the Greeks have a shared history. The Bulgarians among the Bulgars have a shared history. These were once mighty empires. They are some of the most important civilizations in all of Europe. They view themselves as rightfully, they view themselves as they appeal to those ancient and ancient and medieval greatness of their empires and of their cultures, to inspire them to resist the Ottomans and to overthrow their imperial overlords. Believe it or not, Bulgaria had been an empire. We don't talk much about the Bulgarian Empire, but it had been a very powerful empire in the High Middle Ages, in the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries. But like the Greeks, which had been the Byzantines, they were swallowed up by the Ottomans. And now both would use that historical greatness as a rallying cry in order to overthrow the Ottoman yoke. The Greeks would get there first, fighting a war for independence that started in 1820, and after 12 years of blood sacrifice, they finally gain independence with, I believe it's the Treaty of Athens in 1832, and this creates the modern state of Greece. Now, the modern state of Greece is not ancient Greece, it is not Alexander the Great's empire, it is not even the Byzantine Empire, but it is a independent country, very well with its own culture and customs, the seat of Orthodox Christianity, with the Patriarch of Constantinople being considered the head of the Orthodox branch of Christianity. It is an extraordinarily it has these claims, these callbacks to its ancient glory, to its medieval glory as the Byzantines, and to its religious dominance as the place of Christianity. Of Orthodox Christianity, which claims to be one of the original churches founded by Jesus. So they have a religious, cultural, historical claim that they use that doesn't have much to do with who they are in the 1830s, but they use that as a calling card in order to overthrow and cast off the Ottoman yoke. So it's quite a fascinating story when you consider that is a case study of what nationalism uses in order to justify its extreme forms of patriotism and glorification of the nation. Ancient, medieval, any form of history that glorifies the nation can and will be used to basically be an excuse to make the nation as powerful as it possibly can be, and in this case gain full independence and autonomy as an independent state in Europe. And immediately the Greeks set up a monarchy which will last, I think, until the 1940s? Yes, until the Nazi occupation of the 1940s, the Greeks will set up their own monarchy, and for a century, the Greeks are their own independent country. They will fight in the Great War against the Ottomans. They will fight many wars against the Ottomans, as a matter of fact, as the Ottomans continue to weaken throughout the 19th century. The Bulgarians, appealing to their own greatness, their own emperor, their own Kaiser or Tsar, their own background, will throw off the Ottomans in the 1860s, as will many of the other southeastern European states, all of them using nationalism as the reason as to why they deserve their independence. The series of wars that the Ottomans will fight in the late 19th century to try to reclaim some of these lands will be a continual embarrassment, as the Greeks, the Romanians, the Bulgarians will all unify, especially with the outside help of the Russians, to basically continually defeat the Ottomans and claim their own independence as what matters the most. So, what else was I going to say? So that is the Greek side of it. That's the first part of this nationalist movement. You have the rise of Greek nationalism and Balkan nationalism, basically leading to efforts to get rid of the Ottoman control of these areas and create independent states based on the ethnic, cultural, and historical identity of these various different peoples. Stephen the Great in Moldova, Alexander the Great in Greece, the Bulgarian Empire. These will all, Vlad Tepes in Transylvania, Romania, these will all be calling cards for the various different Balkan peoples as they try to assert their independence. In fact, Bosnia gains its independence but is soon absorbed into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a national, it was just an Austrian nationalist empire that was basically doing what it could to suppress the nationalism of the various different ethnic groups within it. And because of this, the Serbians, who want to remain independent while also gaining the Bosnians their independence, will be very upset with this. This will lead to rising tensions, such as the First Balkan War in 1913. And in 1914, obviously, the Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip will kill the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand, in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. And this, of course, will lead, was it in Bosnia? I believe it was in Bosnia. And this, of course, will lead to the Great War. So the Great War is a result of nationalism in the Balkans regions being suppressed by the Austrian Empire. The Ottomans will join that war as a way to regain their authority. The Greeks will join that war as a way to kill off as many Turks as they possibly can. And the Russians will join that war for their own nationalist ambitions. And if you really want to talk about the culmination of nationalism in Europe, it really comes with the Great War. But I'm getting kind of ahead of myself. Let me go to the two other nationalist case studies before I talk about the culmination of 19th century nationalism with the Great War. So there's two other countries. Italy is the next one, because Italy will actually become an independent country before Germany does. Italy is a mess when it comes to division and unity. Italy has been a series of various different city-states and regions that have dominated Italian politics, economics, and culture for the last 1,000 years. Of course, the three major ones going back to the Renaissance were Venice, Florence, and Milan. These cities in the north of Italy had become the dominant cities of culture and art during that period and have been ruled over by several important families like the Borgias and, of course, the Medicis. Italy is of central importance because it is the home of the Catholic Church. The Papal States serves as its own actual country, its own actual region owned by the Pope. So the Pope is as much a political figure in medieval and early modern Europe as he is a religious figure. He is actually oftentimes a general who will lead forces into battle amongst various different warring states. Italy, throughout the medieval period, has been influenced by, and parts of it have been controlled by, various different powers, including the Byzantines, the Normans, the French. Invasions from the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire is not uncommon. Struggles and conflict between the Pope and his political rivals in Europe continually offset this ridiculous notion that the Catholic Church just controlled medieval Europe and did whatever it wanted. That is extraordinarily simplistic, if not completely ridiculous. Yeah. So, anyways, what else? The next thing that but Italy, by the time we get into the 1800s, is heavily divided. The Kingdom of Naples is probably the most powerful of all the Italian states. In the south, it controls the southern part of Italy, including regions like Naples and Calabria, as well as Sicily. Sicily also, by the way, was controlled by the Muslims for some period of time. So Italy has been divided and cut up and occupied and had a development of a shared culture because of those influences, much like the Balkans had, for centuries now. And we're at the point in Italian history where we are starting to deal with the rise of nationalism. You have various different factors trying to build up a nationalist message. But you also have the predilections and interests of various different figures in Europe who are trying to basically gain as much power and influence for their empires as possible. So the story of Italian reunification is not one, or I should say unification. Italy had never been a unified country before then. The story of Italian unification in the 1850s and 60s is one of extreme nationalism by the Italians themselves and the politicking of various different figures in Europe at the time. And there are three that stand out. Franz Joseph I, the Habsburg Emperor of Austria, who in 1867 becomes the King of Hungary, thus combining the Austria and Hungary into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which, like I mentioned before, is this hugely diverse empire that has a lot of problems when it comes to nationalism and really is just the last breath of glory for the Habsburgs themselves. He is basically trying to influence as much of European politics as he possibly can, particularly in the northern parts of Italy. You also, in Tuscany, for instance, You also have Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon, the son of Louis Bonaparte, who had controlled the Netherlands during Napoleon's tenure. He will do his absolute best to to limit the power of the Habsburgs while also increasing his own political power, and he will use Camille de Cavour, the prime minister of the government, the leader of the government of Piedmont Sardinia, which is a constitutional monarchy which controls the northwestern part of Italy and the island of Sardinia. By the way, Napoleon was from Corsica, not Sardinia, so I've mentioned all of the three major Italian islands, by the way, now. So they will he will be, it is Cavour's idea to unify the Italian states under one national government, and he will be heavily helped by the efforts of the French. So Napoleon III will use Cavour as his pawn to fight against the Austro-Hungarians, who do not want Italian reunification. The other issue and impediment to Italian reunification is the Pope, who does not want Italy to be united. He does not want the Papal States to be absorbed into an Italian kingdom, and he will resist this, and this will lead to political complications for the next 70 years. But basically, throughout the 1850s, a series of wars are fought, usually between Piedmont, Sardinia, and Austria-Hungary, that slowly but surely increase Piedmont, Sardinia's control and influence over the northern sections of Italy. At the same time, the French are giving them whatever aid they can, and on top of that, you have the rise of the Kingdom of Naples, trying to unify the central and northern parts of Italy along with it, and they are led by a freedom fighter and general named Giuseppe Garibaldi, who is one of the most well-known Italians in all of history. And Garibaldi basically builds up an extraordinarily resolute power base in the south of Italy, while the Piedmont Sardinians have built up a power base in the north of Italy, and they are both converging on the ancestral capital of the Roman Empire, Rome, and trying to use that, whoever gets to Rome and can control Rome and the Pope, as being the justification for creating an actual nation. This chess race between the various different power players in the different regions of Italy, Italy is a beautiful and fascinating country. What is so fascinating about it is extraordinarily divided based on regions. In many ways, the south of Italy and the north of Italy are very much like England and Scotland. They have very similar ethnic and historical backgrounds, but they consider themselves almost to be completely different people. Southern Italians and Northern Italians do not think of each other in the same as true Italians in many, many different ways. The north of Italy is seen as heavily influenced by the French and the Germans, while the south of Italy is seen as kind of roguish and agrarian and provincial compared to the rest of Italy. So it's actually quite fascinating the way Italy is overcoming centuries-long divides in order to become unified, but those ethnic differences and prejudices will continue amongst the various different Italian peoples in the different paeses or counties or states once the country is unified. Garibaldi is the one who decides to lay down his power. He could have easily tried to create his own country in the south of Italy, but basically, because he's a nationalist, because he believes that the people of the nation of all the Italians need to be unified into one country, he basically defers to Cavour, despite arriving at Rome first. When the Piedmont Sardinians arrive, it is Cavour who is basically given the decision of creating an Italian state. In order to prevent civil war, Garibaldi gives up power and turns it over to Cavour, who places Victor Emmanuel, who is already the king of Piedmont Sardinia, as the king of Italy, creating the Italian monarchy in 1861, and therefore Italy becomes a country. The Papal States will continue to exist eventually, and then in 1870 they are abolished as the Pope hesitantly accepts Italian lordship, and then in 1929 he is given his own land by Benito Mussolini, another nationalist, in the Lateran Treaty, which will basically allow the Pope to have his own city within the city of Rome, and we know this as Vatican City, the smallest country in the world to this day. So Italy is unified because its culture is very much the same. They are Catholics who speak Italian. They have a shared history of the beauties of the Italian city-states in the north, the Renaissance. They, of course, will call back to their ancient Roman origins as a sign of glory and strength, much like the Greeks would do in their revolution against the Ottomans. But what's fascinating is, whereas the Greeks are rebelling against an imperial overlord, the Italians are unifying areas that have been divided for a long time with very sharp prejudices against one another, basically on the whims of the politicking of Napoleon III beating out Franz Joseph for influence over this region of the world. So Napoleon III and the French Empire will form a close connection with Cavour with the Piedmont Sardinians, and then eventually with this new set up Kingdom of Italy in the 1860s. The Kingdom of Italy will last until the 1940s, by the way, when it is done away with shortly after the fall of Mussolini and the end of the last World War. Kind of, you see a pattern emerging? Because I certainly do. It's like nationalism came to die in the 1940s. Okay, now the last major example of nationalism in Europe in the 19th century, of course there are many others, and I have only touched the surface on some of them, is the Germans. By the way, I cannot mention nationalism and the efforts for groups of people to create their own country based on their own principles, ideas, history, and culture without mentioning the 1848 revolutions. What sparked in many ways the nationalist movements in Germany and Italy to actually get going was the revolutions of 1848, which tried to overthrow, which almost overthrew Franz Joseph and the Habsburgs in Austria, tried to overthrow the Prussians, there was a French Revolution at that time that overthrew a constitutional monarchy, and in the vacuum rose Napoleon III to create another French Empire. None of these nationalist movements would have been possible without the liberals and the nationalists and the conservatives and the military working together to crush leftist factions, anarchist factions that arose in different revolutions in different capital cities. 1848 is also the year the Communist Manifesto is released, by the way. However, the real hero of nationalism, the real secret hero of nationalism, who will allow nationalism to grow and develop in places like Germany and Italy because of the success of these different political entities during their revolutions, is Nicholas I, the Tsar of Russia, who will basically send in the Russian army to crush whatever resistance to the Habsburgs, to the Prussians, and basically crush whatever resistance there is to Central European powers. Because the Prussians are able to stay on their imperial thrones and the Habsburgs are, you eventually have the Habsburgs coming to dominate all of Central Europe with the creation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which will basically crush out any idea for peoples like the Slovakians or the Czechs to have their own independent countries for some time. And because the Prince of Grapeshot, during the Prussian ruler, Wilhelm II, or Wilhelm III, I think, is able to basically stave off a revolution that would have overthrown him, the Prussians are now able to start their own movement. Basically, the 19th century had been a back-and-forth tug-of-war of superiority between the Prussians and the Austrians. However, William III is gifted with probably the greatest politician or political mind of Europe in the 19th century. His chancellor, a man named Otto von Bismarck, basically runs the government. It is a constitutional, once again, we have a constitutional monarchy where the monarch does have real perceptible power. This isn't like England with its figurehead monarchs, but the monarch is kind of is obviously responsible to the government, and the government can make their own laws and operates on a constitutional basis and all of these things. So I'm going to need to charge my phone in a second, but can everybody hear and see me okay? Am I coming in clear? As I take a sip of coffee, I hope you're liking and subscribing. This is part one for today. We are doing 2 live stream lectures on this, and we will also be discussing the history of the American Revolution a little bit. So let me plug in my phone to charge. I don't have my mic now, so hopefully that's okay. All right, what happens next? The German nationalism, which is probably the most famous nationalism of the 19th century, rises and falls with Otto von Bismarck. In many ways, German nationalism will cause a world war, but it will also be extraordinarily important to the development of the identity of Europe. This large area in the middle of Europe for centuries had very little political power. The Habsburgs had their dominant influence over it for quite some time, but the Holy Roman Empire during the medieval and early modern period had basically deteriorated in the power that it once held, to the point where it was a ceremonial position, a popularity contest with bragging rights, that was really a way for the Prussians and the Austrians to compete against each other. The idea that the Prussians have, and again, history is all about ideas, is that they will, the idea that the Prussians have is that they will unify all of the German people under the Prussian banner, and this is really Bismarck's doing. Bismarck creates basically, I forget the name of it, but he creates an economic community, which is basically a mutual defense pact, but also an economic trade agreement with major German states, basically tying them to Prussia and excluding Austria. They will win several different wars, one against the Danes, two against the Austrians. Um, and throughout much of the rest of the 1850s and 60s, with William III as the king of Prussia, the Prussians will slowly but surely gain more land, more influence, and more resources, and they will also take over the responsibility of heavily industrializing the German region. The fascinating thing is that Germany as a power is almost undefeatable compared to the other powers of Europe. It has less land than Russia, and it has and it has a less capable navy than the English, but it doesn't, and its population is about equal to that of the French. But what it does have in perpetuity is German engineering, lots of factories, lots of industrialization, and lots of resources. So the huge problem of the 20th century in European geopolitics is what do you do with Germany, because Germany will become quite the pest for quite some time. It will, of course, be ruled by the Kaiser. You have the Great War, then you have the rise of the Nazis, and then you have the Cold War, where it is divided. Understanding the influence and power and dominance that Germany can have in European geopolitics is going to be a real headache for the next century and a half after the 1848 revolutions and the rise of Bismarck as the head of state in Germany, or I should say in Prussia. The Prussian Austrians fight several different wars, and they are mainly for bragging rights. However, Prussia is far more industrialized than the Austrians are, and the Austrians are beaten back. Austria is so debilitated that the actual merging, the Anschluss, as it is called, between Austria and Hungary in 1867 saves the Habsburgs from totally collapsing, as their power base in Austria doesn't have them standing up at all to the French, the Germans, or the Russians. So the Prussians will basically use their industrialization as a carrot and stick approach. The carrot will be to grant industrialization and economic opportunities and social mobility to the centralized German peoples, who are only unified by their culture and language. They are various different states with their own political agendas that are all relatively insignificant and powerless compared to the great European empires that are building and surrounding them, like the Austrians, the French, and the Russians. So what happens next? Well, I'm glad you asked. The Prussians use this carrot approach to basically entice a bunch of the different German peoples to relying on Prussian industrialization to make them powerful. And the more powerful they become, the more absorbed and controlled they are by the Prussians. The Prussians grow their hegemony by basically giving gifts to the rest of Germany, and the gift that they bring is industrialization. And an industrialized Germany is a powerful Germany, and a powerful Germany is a threat to the rest of Europe, as all the other empires can realize. The efforts by the Austrians to stop this go nowhere. They are basically thrown off because despite them being Germanic peoples just like the Prussians and the rest of the Germans, they do not have the economic feasibility or political clout to withstand Bismarck's politicking or the power of King William III and his army. So basically, the Prussians become the Mary Sue who can do no wrong for the German people, and the Austrians are slowly but surely pushed out of the woodwork. And by the mid to late 1860s, it is obvious that Germany is organizing into some sort of country that is dominated by the Prussians. The final straw comes when the French decide to do what they can to push out the Germans. The worry of the rise of the Prussians by the French basically sends Napoleon III into a tirade, and this leads to the fight over Alsace-Lorraine and the famous Franco-Prussian War. It's a very quick war. The Prussians are successful. They kidnap Bonaparte. He is pictured with Bismarck, and basically because of that, you have the end. The French Empire collapses. The French have a revolution. This is the Commune Revolution, and basically they agree to get rid of the emperor and create a republican government with no emperor, no constitutional monarchy. So the various despotic rules in France during the 19th century are now completely over with and done away with, while the Germans and the Prussians the Prussians have now captured Alsace-Lorraine. They have proven themselves to be able to defeat the French, and the Germans have benefited greatly from them. And so Bismarck feels that he is now powerful enough to declare Germany as an empire, unifying all of the states of Germany except Liechtenstein under the Prussian banner, and the King of Prussia, William III, will now become the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm I. So after a decades-long effort by Bismarck, which had included the continual ousting and pushing away of the Austrians and their influence and power, the Prussians have now asserted themselves as the dominant force controlling Germany. So now Bismarck will continue to remain an influential figure in German and European politics. He will help the Europeans figure out and divide up Africa. I talked about this in the live stream lecture last week, which probably prevents a world war. However, he is eventually pushed out of power by Kaiser Wilhelm I's son, who is also named Wilhelm, and this is Kaiser Wilhelm II, who basically takes all the goodwill that Bismarck had built by politicking with various different Europeans, particularly the British and the Russians, and basically tick them off to the point where they are absolutely sick and tired of his shenanigans, and that leads to the Great War. So the Great War is in many ways an end to the glories of the nationalism of the 19th century. The nationalism of the 20th century that emerges from after the end of the Great War will be far darker, far more sinister, and far more authoritarian. Whereas the nationalism of the 19th century is built on the pageantry and shared culture of these European people appealing to their ancient, medieval, and even early modern glories, the nationalism of the 20th century will appeal to these things, but in a much more despotic manner, in a much more vindictive and vengeful way. And I'm going to explain that briefly. But basically, the Great War, I could do an entire live stream lecture. In fact, I have about the Great War. I've done videos on the Great War. It is a fascinating story. The First or Second World War, depending on your opinion. I believe there have been 3 world wars, all of them started by Germans, all of them for the glories of Prussia, all of them for the expansion of the German Empire, and the Germans only won the first one. And that's because the British were on their side. Yes, go and watch my video on the 7 Years' War, because that is the First World War. Am I coming in clear? Can everybody see and hear me okay? Because now I'm seeing people complaining about the. I hope I'm coming in clear. Okay, now I can put my microphone back in. Anyways, so what happens next? The Russians and the Prussians and the Germans, well, the Russians and the Germans and the British and the French basically go to war. They all have large international empires that are extraordinarily powerful. They are all industrialized to one extent or another, and the industrial apparatuses that they have built now produce engines of warfare that will devastate and destroy countless lives. Tens of millions of lives will be ruined because of this war. Tens of millions of people will die. Many, many more millions will suffer horrible privations because of war-torn economies, rationing, starvation, blockades, bread lines and riots. The Russian Revolution will happen because of this, which I've talked about ad nauseum on this channel. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, already weak before the war, a paper tiger compared to the other European giants, will completely collapse during the war. The Germans will somehow withstand the British, the French, the Russians, and even the Americans for some time, but they will eventually falter, and the Kaiser will go into exile in Belgium with his mistress, while leaving Germany to suffer in the wake. And the nationalism of all of these empires, which believe themselves to all be superior, is now bathed in blood and guts and all sorts of horrific results in the trenches of the Western Front, and the millions of dead bodies scattered across the Eastern Front of the Great War. It is one of the most appalling examples of civilized societies, basically proving that they are not civilized. The Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire will all collapse. Where the British Empire will reach its greatest power yet, Italy will be devastated because it doesn't get the glory that it believes it deserves, despite double-crossing the Germans and working with the Americans and the Brits, and that will lead to the economic. And so you fight a giant war. You have huge casualties. You don't get any of the rewards you think you're going to get, and because of that, your economy is in a downturn. You don't have anything to compensate it, and your government collapses. And this leads to the March on Rome, the rise of leftist ideologies, of which fascism was originally a leftist ideology, and you're going to see the overthrow of the Italian government and the rise of Benito Mussolini in 1922. And again, the Nazis are established before Adolf Hitler is in the room, And Hitler is in fact in prison, and it looks like the Germans are going to do away with Nazism, but the Great Depression reopens the wounds from the Great War, and the German right wing basically allies themselves with the Nazis in order to crush the communists in Germany, and this leads, of course, to the rise of the Third Reich. Both Germany and Italy at this time will be heavily influenced and controlled by nationalist ideology that is built on basically avenging the losses and the lack of victory and the lack of glory that these kingdoms, these areas, these regions had because of from the Great War. So. Anyways, so there is a new nationalism in town. Um, the the new nationalism is a vengeful, vindictive, violent one that will be far more deadly than the first nationalism. But the first nationalism, which creates the modern states of Italy and Germany, I think, is what I wanted to discuss with you. It's what you actually voted on. The plurality of you voted on that one being the topic for today. So we were able to get through that. And I also would like to talk about the second. I have two topics because I wasn't able to do the live stream last week. So I hope you enjoyed me talking about nationalism in Europe in the 20th century, in the 19th century mainly, a little bit of the 20th century too. And if you did, like and subscribe. And we're going to look at the American founding now, and I'm going to look at it more. I've talked about this before. I've done this topic. I'm going to look at it more as a political reality than a military revolution, because I've talked about the American Revolution before. The American founding is not possible. Rick Young, fascism under Mussolini was a right-wing movement. Google it. No, that isn't true. Fascism is a socialist movement that combines socialist authoritarianism, planned economies and things like that, with the cultural apparatuses that are usually seen in nationalism. Look that up, because that's the actual truth. Mussolini was a socialist. The guy who founded fascism was a socialist. Fascism rejected communism as a save-all because of a global revolution, and actually believed that you could have socialism existing in a single state that also used its nationalist origins and ideas to keep people in line. And the end result, of course, just like with communism, is authoritarianism. So no, the idea that Mussolini and Hitler were right-wing is a little bit of a stretch. It's dishonest, at least. So what happens next? And I'm trying to fix it because I don't know why my background, I'm blending into the background so much. Let me see here. Maybe it's just a stupid photo. Okay. So so now we're going to look at America, and you could call this American nationalism. I'm not answering questions right now. I'm doing my live stream lecture. I answer questions Fridays and Saturdays. Sorry if I haven't interacted with the chat that much, but that's why. So the American Revolutionary Movement is really an outgrowth of the Enlightenment. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, these are all, James Madison, these are all titans of Enlightenment philosophy who have a huge role to play within Enlightenment philosophy, but in the American side of things. Now, the Enlightenment had been a series of political philosophies that had developed from the late 17th century onward, which advocated a reforming of the idea of the state of nature. The state of nature is what people are like without any government. So theorists and philosophers basically came up with these ideas of what would the world look like without any government at all. Without any government at all, what is humankind actually like? How do they interact with each other, and what is their default state? The three major voices on this were Thomas Hobbes, who speaks first about it in reaction to the English Civil War and the overthrow of the English monarchy for 11 years in 1649. His famous work Leviathan, written in the 1650s, basically advocates for believes that mankind is evil and fallen because they are sinful, and taking Christian theology and applying it to the political sphere, he believes because of this, humanity will only use their freedom to do evil, and therefore you need a strong authoritarian government that will basically be ruled by a powerful despot, a king, or even a dictator, who would basically be able to keep people in line. And this is Hobbesian thought. It borrows from Machiavelli. It rejects Aristotelian political philosophy, and votes for more of a authoritarian, votes for authoritarianism as a way to keep evil people in line. Leviathan is a giant monster from the Bible, and basically Hobbes believed that the political state needed to be this giant monster in order to keep people in control and in line. So that's the Hobbesian model. That is one of the first commentaries on it. Believing that human beings are evil in their natural state of nature, they will be chaotic, it will be chaos and anarchy, and they will destroy everything unless they are properly whipped into shape. That is Hobbesian. So then you have the development of Lockean philosophy. Now, Lockean philosophy is the one that is most directly influential on the American founding. John Locke, who is now reacting not to the English Civil War, but again, historical events and occurrences will influence the way people understand and interpret particular or different events. This is absolutely inevitable. Marx is responding to the French Revolution, for instance, and has his interpretations of feudalism and the bourgeoisie, because that is how the French system had been built before the Revolution. It was a feudal society that had not adapted properly in centuries. Hobbes is responding to a civil war. He's responding to the chaos and anarchy that comes from a political system that is now just experiencing life without a monarch for the first time in centuries. And Locke is responding to the English Civil War, or not the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. James II, rather than cause another war, another civil war, decides to leave the country and abdicate so that his daughter and her husband, William and Mary, may come over and become the monarchs of England because Parliament has asked them to do so. James will get buyer's remorse and try to come back, and this will lead to several different wars, including the Jacobite Rebellion in the 18th century. But basically, the English are now the English have this glorious revolution, a bloodless revolution, a constitution is created, a Bill of Rights is assumed under that constitution, and Parliament gains far more political power than it ever has before, basically creating a constitutional monarchy in England from then on out for the next century and a half. The constitutional monarchy system of England develops during the time of the American colonies. Locke, who writes the charter for North Carolina as one of his most important documents, will write several treatises on government, and his second treatise is probably his most famous one. Locke, responding to this, makes a commentary, once again, on the state of nature and what mankind is like when he is left alone. Locke believes that humans are evil, are not naturally good, and can be given towards evil, but that they will not, but they can also do good to each other. He takes a far less severe view of Hobbes. And again, if this was a philosophy channel, there'd be so much to analyze, or a political channel, there'd be so much to analyze about how historical context and religious dogma influences the minds of these three men that I'm discussing right now. Hobbes is obviously heavily influenced by the puritanical idea that looks at the depravity and the fallenness of humanity in relation to God because they are good Calvinist Protestants. Locke is more influenced by a growing Enlightenment philosophy, which will be far more and Anglican philosophy, which is far less hefty and heavy in its criticism of the human condition. There's a softening of the Puritanism of the late 16th and first half of the 17th century by the later part of the 17th century, where the Church of England has become far less dogmatically Calvinistic and far less focused on the depravity and fallenness of the human being in relation to God in Christian theology. Because of this, you can have a much more open, tolerant, and positive view of human nature by somebody like John Locke. You can still believe that human beings are fallen and evil, but you can also have more sympathy for the human creature than Hobbes will, because he is obviously heavily influenced by the Puritans. So Locke, I don't believe either man to be particularly religious. I think Hobbes might have been. Locke is a deist. Deism is the belief, and this will come up again, that human beings are on their own. God made the world. He made the world good. He put it in order the way that the Bible basically says it, and then he kind of left it to its own devices, and he doesn't interfere with the affairs of humankind. He has left humankind to decide their own fate, and that is what humans are trying to do. They're trying to figure out the best way to live. So political philosophy, experimentation of belief, and interaction between government, this is all huge for the Enlightenment philosophers. This is after the scientific revolution, after the age of exploration, after the Renaissance, and they are all heavily influenced by these different movements, including the Reformation, the religious movement which had created Protestantism in the first place. So Locke, commenting in response to Hobbes, takes a softer view of human nature and basically believes that humans don't have to be ruled over by a despot. In fact, Hobbes resents the idea of a despot. He saw rulers he looks back at the last century of English history, and he has seen despots try to control English politics. For the longest time in European political philosophy had been heavily influenced by the divine right of kings. The idea that the ruler was appointed by God to do what God wanted to, so questioning him was a matter of questioning God. Hobbes will push back on this and reject this notion entirely. Hobbes's picture is basically that human beings are in the state of nature, again, the state of nature is without any government, left to their own devices, without any sort of organization, in perhaps the most archaic and ancient of circumstances, again, a circumstance Marx himself will investigate later on, are able to interact with each other in positive ways. That basically people will acquire goods, which he calls property, and they will use this property to benefit themselves. And the usages of this property can not only benefit themselves, but benefit others. You build an apple tree, you grow apples on the apple tree, you sell some of the apples to somebody else. You have not lost anything, he has not lost anything, you have both benefited, and you are both better off because of that. Left to your own devices, humans will use their ingenuity and innovation in order to benefit not only mainly themselves, but also indirectly other people. This is also a building block of capitalism, and Adam Smith will take this and run with it 100 years later. But basically, Locke believes that human beings in the state of nature are going to do good to each other. However, they can also do great harm. How do you prevent the guy who grows the apples from getting his apple orchard stolen and then somebody else taking the fruits of his labor? How do you protect somebody's property? How do you protect somebody's life? How do you protect somebody's freedom to operate within this society? The state of nature cannot do that. You have no strictures in place to prevent people from doing harm to one another, and human beings are still evil, so human beings will do evil to one another. So because of that, you have to have a government. A government is set up by the people, for the people, and of the people. Yes, that's where Lincoln and Jefferson get that idea from, in order to basically ensure that people's fundamental freedoms that they have are not infringed upon. This is what Locke calls natural rights. Natural rights are rights that are given to you by ipso facto, by the fact that you are human. They come from God. They are just part of your human nature. The three most important to Locke are life, liberty, and property. Not the pursuit of happiness. That's an Aristotelian political philosophy, not a part of his philosophy. The pursuit of happiness is the pursuit of goodness and virtue, because for Aristotle, you cannot be good and happy unless you are virtuous. So governments are there to protect your rights, make sure they are not taken away. The government does not give you your rights. They do not guarantee you your rights. They do not recognize a right. They do not create a right. They recognize rights that are already there from before. This is Lockean philosophy. And I'm going on about this one because this is probably the most fundamental to what I called liberalism earlier, to classical liberalism, to right-wing political theories today, and of course, mainly to the American founding. The founding fathers, to one extent or another, were Lockean in their philosophy. The third thinker, of course, Voltaire and Montesquieu deserve honorable mentions. The French political philosophers of the 18th century are extraordinarily important. Montesquieu believes in breaking down the different sections of government into different branches that all share power and bounce off of one another, and of course this will heavily influence Madison. You also have Voltaire, who believes in the importance of of recognizing certain freedoms of people that are without government and getting rid of church and state, making sure the church does not control the state and the state does not control the church. So, however, we have Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who will be extremely influential in the development of more left-wing political philosophy in the 19th and 20th centuries. And of course, whereas Locke believed that human beings were victims of their nature and beneficiaries of their nature, and Hobbes believed that human beings were only victims of their nature, Rousseau believed that human beings were victims of their surroundings. Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. Um, Rousseau believed that the government needed to be something that was done based on a general agreement of the people. This is called the social contract. People would come together and basically agree to have a government work for them, to basically guarantee that they were protected, um, and they would form their own societies, and hopefully those societies would keep them from becoming enchained. The various different cultural apparatuses, the various different religious and social commitments that people had created for themselves was what kept human beings from becoming fully free. That is Rousseauian philosophy. Human beings are born good, they have incredible potential, they are not evil, and yet they are constantly being henpecked by different authoritarian, establishmentarian organizations that keep them from reaching their fullest potential. And so human beings who do evil are doing evil because society has made them evil, not because there is anything in nature that is evil about them. Rousseau believes in what's called the general will, and this is part of his social contract theory. Basically, these are the building blocks of popular sovereignty and things like this, that people should work together to form a basic consensus for what their government and society should look like, or else that government and society will continually create circumstances wherein they do evil to one another and terrible things happen. That is absolutely essential to Rousseauian philosophy. Rousseau is a contemporary of the American Revolution, and his ideas are popular with people like Thomas Jefferson, but not with people like John Adams, for instance. So Lockean political philosophy is the dominant political philosophy of the American founding. But Hobbesian political philosophy and Rousseauian political philosophy, as both the old guard and the new guard, and Locke in the middle, are all going to influence the founding fathers. They're all going to have some sort of understanding of these different political philosophies, and will argue how much government is necessary to ensure people's freedoms. Do you need a strong centralized government that keeps the states under control? Do you have a weak federal government that basically allows people to do as they want, because they are a part of Rousseauian philosophy is people are generally goods, so they should be not henpecked by their government? That is the debate that happens between amongst the founders. Um, throughout, and the biggest one is between Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton after the founding, of how free should how should the country be run? How much centralized authority does the government need? How much recognition of individual rights and freedoms do people get? Um, the American founding, the Declaration of Independence, basically accuses King George III of being a Hobbesian ruler who has basically become a tyrant, and because he is a tyrant, they will have nothing to do with him. The Declaration itself is not only the famous, we hold these truths to be self-evident, which Jefferson pulls heavily from Locke, by the way, in that, but is also the idea, but is also a series of complaints lodged against King George for his oppression of various of people, the closing of Boston Harbor, the taxation without representation, basically allowing British soldiers to force themselves into American homes. This is a topic I have lectured on and discussed a lot before, but basically there was never really a problem with the amount of taxation that the British were doing. It was that the Americans were being taxed and didn't have a say in what would actually be taxed or how much it would be taxed, and couldn't actually petition the government of the King of England or have any say in Parliament. The refusal of the British to allow them this luxury is what really caused the revolutionary movement. So that's basically what happened. So that is the first chapter of it. The second chapter is with the Articles of Confederation. Once independence is declared by the Americans in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, which is heavily written by Jefferson, who again is heavily influenced by Locke, there is now the debate about how strong the government of the United States is going to be comes into focus. And at first, a very weak government is created by the Articles of Confederation, which basically allows a Congress to be established, one branch of government rather than three, and you have one representative from each state voting for various different things that have to do more with military operations, national defense, and things of that nature. States would be able to print their own currency, they'd be able to come up with their own economic systems, basically, and there was no proper regulation of interstate commerce or trade. There was no way to create one form of currency, one form of banking. There was no way to basically keep the states united for any sort of mercantile, economic, or social enterprise. You were only hoping that they would be able to get along with each other. That meant that whenever there were conflicts with the states or within or inside of the states, there was nothing that the federal government could do to actually settle these problems. The regional differences between areas like the South and New England were almost never taken into account, and these places almost operated as though they were their own countries during the 1780s. Shays' Rebellion, the failure of dealing with paying revolutionary troops leading to the rebellion, the weakness of continental money, the inability to pay off America's war debts, basically made it clear to Jefferson and Washington and Franklin that this wasn't going to work, that the Articles were way too weak. So Washington stacks the deck. While many of the founders believe that maybe the Articles of Confederation could be fixed, Washington believes that that there needs to be a new form of government that has a stronger centralized authority that can actually regulate relations between the states, and that the states would be subsidiary to, not equal to, in their power. This is what we call federalism. That's why the movement to create the U.S. Constitution is called the Federalist Movement. That's why the political party is called the Federalists. They believe in a strong centralized authority that will basically have the states be subordinate to them and have the local municipalities be subordinate to the states. So the city of Phoenix, Arizona doesn't operate under the same principles and laws of the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. However, they both are following their own state laws, which the states of Arizona and Michigan may have their own state laws, but they are all at the same time following federal laws that apply to Michigan and Arizona, to Grand Rapids and Phoenix, and so on and so forth, and other places in the country as well. So this is the idea of subsidiary federalism that will be elucidated in a new document. Washington, who is not the political brilliant mind and philosopher that Jefferson is, needs someone like Jefferson to write the document. The problem is Jefferson is the minister to France at the time, so he is in France. John Adams is in England, so Washington turns to a young 37-year-old, yes, 37 was young then, 36-year-old man named James Madison. Madison becomes the primary writer of the U.S. Constitution, we the people, and basically creates a new form of government that declares that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, this is the Supremacy Clause, and sets up a different branched system of government, which, despite many debates and critiques and problems, they eventually settle on two chambers, two parts of the legislative branch, the House of Representatives based on the population, which will give power, more political power in that part of Congress to larger states, in that case, Pennsylvania or New York, in today's case, places like California or Texas, and a Senate, an upper chamber based on the Roman Senate that will have equal representation per state, 2 men from every state, or 2 people, I should say, from every state. Of course, that's why there are 50 states. There are 100 U.S. senators to this day. The Congress, the legislative branch, is the first article because the founders intended for the Congress to be the most powerful part of the American government. The Congress's job is to make laws. They have the ability to tax. It would be a travesty in their mind to let one person control the economic strictures of the country. That was what they saw with King George III, and that's what they didn't like, even though their problems were also with a divided government, because you had a British monarch who still had a lot of political power at the time, and a British parliament, a legislative branch, that would eventually become the dominant political force in Britain. The king now has no power. The 1832 Reform Act basically did away with any sort of real, legitimate policy-making power of the British sovereign. What happens next? Well, the third article pertains to the courts. The courts interpret the laws that are passed by the legislative branch and then enforced by the president. The president is supposed to follow the Constitution and enforce the laws that are set up. Once again, this is Montesquieu, this is the French Revolution, this is French philosophy influencing James Madison. And the French Revolution is getting started this time, and Thomas Jefferson's really excited for it until he sees a bunch of people getting killed, and then he starts to become more hesitant about it. So you have a division of government, you have branches of government, you have separation of powers, but you also have the ability of these different branches to check each other. The president can veto laws and things like this. The Congress can overturn his vetoes. The Senate has to approve his appointments, and the courts can declare laws unconstitutional. It's not in the Constitution, but it is an outworking of how the judicial branch is supposed to work from the Constitution. The judiciary is subordinate to Congress at first, with the Judiciary Act of 1789 basically establishing the federal court system in America. The Supreme Court met in the Senate building for the first 140 years of its operation. So Madison, basically corresponding with Jefferson, sets up this government that has a strong centralized authority. In fact, he actually clashes with his mentor and friend Thomas Jefferson because he's a little bit more of a federalist than Jefferson is at the time. This is also the rise of Alexander Hamilton and a very, very old Benjamin Franklin, who was continually being the power behind the throne, pushing things here and there, while George Washington operates as the president and leader of the Constitutional Convention during the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, the same place they had written and signed the Declaration of Independence 11 years prior. So the Constitution is the third phase, and it gets rid of the Articles of Confederation, and it basically, despite the continual debate being how much power does the federal government and the states have, a debate that rages on to this day, they come up with a system that basically says states are not as powerful as the federal government. They have to have some sort, they can have their representatives, they can have their influence, but they have to have some sort of duty and obligation to a federal government. So, yeah. What else was going to happen? So that's the creation of the American system. Now, of course, none of this would have been guaranteed without the bloodshed of Americans during the American Revolution, and none of it would have been able to held on unless the Americans were able to keep the British from retaking their country in 1812 or from falling apart themselves on their own during the Civil War. The only guarantee of these things was bloodshed and the arming of the people. Now, that obviously leads to the Bill of Rights. So, basically, the Bill of Rights is not in the original drafts of the Constitution. There was a segment of the founders who were very opposed to the idea of a strong centralized authority. Some of them just basically wanted the Articles of Confederation to be tweaked here or there or stay the same. But people like George Mason and Edmund Randolph, for instance, not Edmund Randolph, George Mason, Patrick Henry, for instance, give me liberty or give me death guy, wasn't a fan of this. Jefferson wasn't a fan of it, but he wasn't anywhere around. And John Adams was a fan of it, but he wasn't in town. In order to advocate for the institution of the Constitution, Madison teams up with Alexander Hamilton, who will later become his political rival, and another man who you may have heard of, who is the first Supreme Court Chief Justice in U.S. history, a man named John Jay, and they will write a series of essays arguing for the need for a strong centralized authority running the states, called the Federalist Papers. And borrowing from Locke, Madison will say, if men were angels, there'd be no need of government. Basically, human beings could operate in a state of nature perfectly fine without government if they were perfect, but human beings are not perfect, and therefore you need restrictions on them. You need checks and balances on the different powers and authorities within the country, and you can't have total anarchy. You must have a centralized authority that is able to keep people from going crazy, and the states were going crazy, and that was basically the argument. In order to keep everything in line, you need a strong centralized authority, and also that strong centralized authority needs to keep people in check, but it needs to keep itself in check. So that's where you get the checks and the balances. That way, no branch of the U.S. government should ever get too powerful. If it does, then you are headed towards tyranny, or something else, oligarchy, whatever you want to call it. So that's part of the issue there. Basically, you have to create a government that will control the people, but will also control itself. A government that recognizes the rights of the people, but does not see itself as the thing that created those rights. And that is why you have two chambers within the Congress. You have various different parts of the judicial branch. You have an extensive executive department, which Washington creates on his own when he becomes the first president. Big shocker. George Washington was the first U.S. president. And yes, I talked about John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. So Hamilton, Jay, and Madison basically argue you need a government that can control itself and can make sure the people get what they need, but is not the provider of those rights. It is simply the recognizer and protector of those rights. However, in order to make sure that government is hogtied and is not seen as the central authority that gives these people these rights, there are demands for a Bill of Rights stipulated and articulated in writing that recognize certain things people have, certain things states have, that the government cannot give to people. These are recognitions of rights that, once again, they believe to come from God. Now this leads to the debate, and I've talked about this recently. Were all the founding fathers Christians? No. Were they all Bible-believing, God-fearing Christians? No. Most of them were Protestant Christians, at least confessionally, creedally, and historically. Some of them had more deistic beliefs that basically believed God was, like I said, the clockmaker who had made this beautiful organization called humanity, but it was humans' job to right the ship. And some of them were more secular than even that. But even some of the more secular ones, like Benjamin Franklin, seemed to have some sort of understanding of a God who had who govern the universe according to certain laws and principles. Um, and it is an effort by a lot of people in modern academia to secularize the founding fathers, but they were not secular thinkers. They were not secularists. They might have been secular for that time compared to when you have a population that's 98% Christian and creedal affirming and belonging to particular churches. They believe in separation of church and state, but they don't believe in. But they believe that the state should not control the church, and there shouldn't be a church that runs the state. That is the anti-establishment clause in the First Amendment. So these men are religious. They believe in some sort of, at the very least, at the very minimum, the Judeo-Christian ethic of the West being necessary to create a thoughtful population and a good government. And for some of them, it may be just what works, and for some of them, it may be what they believe doctrinally. It's a spectrum. It's not one or the other. John Adams perfectly said that a moral people was necessary for the running of the American government, and that might elucidate it. These people may not have believed every single doctrinal part of the Nicene Creed, but they did believe that the Christian ethic established by Jesus and his apostles was necessary for a society to flourish, or at the very least, that was the only one that they had, so shut up and get over it. Now that I've talked about that, which I think is extraordinarily controversial, and I don't think a lot of people would agree with me, but it's actually true. And some people just want to, this is the wall builder nonsense. This is Dave Barton. This is they were all Christians. And even if they didn't seem to be Christians, they were Christians. That is the right-wing interpretation of it. That is not what actually happened. There is a spectrum of belief amongst these men. And it's fascinating to learn about. But so what matters is, at the very least, they were willing to assume the truth of the Judeo-Christian ethic in order to influence the creation of their state. That's why the Ten Commandments, which is a Jewish, and the reason I use Judeo-Christian, which also offends a lot of people, is because when you say the term Judeo, you have to say that includes the Jews, and that drives people insane. The Ten Commandments being on government buildings all over the place and statues of Moses and things like this is obviously because that was the lawgiver of the Jewish people and by extension to the Christians as well. So you have to so the recognition of the importance of law and order in a society, which God gives to Moses in the book of Exodus, is then the founders see themselves doing the exact same thing with the creation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights recognizes rights that the founders believe generally came from God, or from nature at the very least, of nature or nature's God, as Jefferson writes in the Declaration. So was monogamy? Okay, I'm not answering questions right now. I'm trying to get through the lecture, and I have to charge my phone again. So give me a second here. You can take that moment to like and subscribe if you haven't already. I thought I wasn't going to be able to get. What's the topic, Jay? Oh, good to see you, by the way. We did nationalism in Europe the first hour, in the 19th century in particular, and now we're looking at the American founding. So we're kind of all over the place, but it was the top 2 voted on topics here on YouTube. So what happens next? The founders basically come up with the idea of the Bill of Rights being a justification and protection of rights guaranteed to people by either in the most secular sense, their human existence, in the most religious sense, rights that God had given them because he had created them. Whatever way you want to interpret it, that is the way natural rights can be defined. They are rights that come from nature, from being human. And this is again Lockean, this is again Rousseauian, this is the Enlightenment coming to fruition in America. And you can call it the American political enlightenment with Jefferson and Madison and Franklin and all of these guys, and Hamilton and Adams. So the way it basically works is this. Madison writes 13, and it's then narrowed to 12, and it's narrowed to 10 amendments. Additions to the Constitution that basically articulate in writing, clear as day, the rights of the people. It starts with the First Amendment and the 5 freedoms: the freedom of press, speech, religion, assembly, and petition. Every single right that is elucidated in the first 10 is something that the founders believed had been taken from them during the tyranny of the British. Now, whether you agree with that or not is a matter of historical interpretation. I am saying what the founders themselves believed. They believed that their rights had been violated by the British monarchy and government in some way, shape, or form, and so they needed to elucidate them to prevent the American government from ever becoming like the British government. the efforts of the monarch of England to try to establish a colonial religion in America had flown in the face of the First Great Awakening and the efforts of the Americans to basically diversify their religious experience with Methodists in the South, Methodists and Baptists in the South, Congregationalists in New England, and Anglicans and Episcopalians in the East on the East Coast. You have and you have the Catholic colony of Maryland, for example. So the religious diversity of America makes it a lot harder to establish the Church of America. And so basically the founders create a separation of church and state so that no particular religious organization is the church, while other churches are acceptable, but people will be taxed to go there. That is what the Church of England have been doing for quite some time at that point. So you have that, and then you have the freedom of press. The ability of the press to write what they want about a particular topic, to spread ideas, even if it's misinformation, was central to the founders. One of the most famous examples of freedom of the press from the colonial era is Paul Revere's famous depiction of the Boston Massacre as this bloody killing of Americans, of helpless Americans, by awful British soldiers. Absolute, blown out of proportion, exaggeration, hyperbolic nonsense. But it's still freedom of press. It's the freedom to express yourself using writing, the freedom to express yourself using your thoughts and your words, freedom of speech, freedom of petition and assembly, the ability to gather and to say to your government, we don't like the way things are going, so you should change it, has gone on especially during the progressive era in American history, to lead to the creation of referendums and recalls and initiatives and things like that continue to impact even the smallest forms of municipal government to this day. The Second Amendment clearly is probably the most controversial. It establishes the right of the people to keep and bear arms in order to keep themselves safe from a tyrannical government. It wasn't for hunting and fishing. Now, that obviously has changed dramatically in how it impacts people. The debate becoming the most controversial in American history of any of the amendments, in my opinion. You have the Third Amendment, which no one talks about, which basically says the government cannot force soldiers to live in your home, something the British had done, according to the Americans. The Fourth Amendment guarantees that nothing can be taken or searched, no search or seizure without a probable reason. This creates the idea of getting search warrants, of probable cause, all of these things. The Fifth Amendment says that no one can be forced to self-incriminate. They can protect themselves and remain silent. This is where we get eventually the Miranda rights from. You can't be convicted twice for the same crime, double jeopardy. The Sixth Amendment basically says everybody has the right to a speedy trial. You will not be kept in prison for years awaiting a trial and sentencing. The Seventh Amendment says that trial will be a trial of jury of your peers. Grand juries will also exist. That's either the Sixth or the Seventh Amendment. You also have the Eighth Amendment says if you are convicted of a crime, you will not be excessively fined or cruelly punished. You cannot have your head chopped off for stealing a candy bar. The Ninth Amendment says that whatever rights are not dictated in the Constitution belong to the individual. Basically, there are rights that do exist besides these, and those are retained by the individual. The 10th Amendment says that states have their own individual rights that they can elucidate and dictate on their own. And from there have been 17 amendments to the Constitution ever since then that have been approved by either state legislatures or by an overwhelming majority of both chambers of the U.S. Congress. Those form the bedrock. That forms the bedrock of the American founding. The Declaration of Independence, the weak Articles of Confederation, the formation of a Constitution, which was ratified by all 13 states and basically allowed everybody to get together and create a government. This was all by the consent of the governed. It was of, by, and for the people, a Rousseauian idea. You don't have a government unless people are willing to work together and agree to a general principle of how things will work. You have Washington becoming the first president, with John Adams becoming the vice president, a position he hated. You have Washington creating a cabinet of advisors, like the Secretary of State, Treasury, War, and the Attorney General, as well as the Postmaster General. And Jefferson and Hamilton and Henry Knox will fill up some of those positions. You also have the creation of Congress. You have the creation of the judiciary system with the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789. You have judicial review established in 1803, which basically says the court can determine if laws are constitutional or not and get rid of them because of that. And that's how the entire system kind of comes to be. And in order to guarantee the rights of the individual are treated just as hallowed as the structure of the government, the Constitution does not come without the Bill of Rights, which is adopted soon after the Constitution is. So, that's a basic summation of all of it. And yeah, that's the American founding in a nutshell. I didn't need as much time to go into that because I didn't have to talk about the American Revolution that much. I just talked about the different political governments and apparatuses that were created by the American founders, why they created them and how they created them and what they actually say and do. And I even gave a quick rundown of the 10 Amendments. So if you enjoyed that, yeah, please like and subscribe. I'm going to sign off in a couple of minutes. We did both topics, so we made up for last week where we didn't have a live stream lecture. We'll be back again with a live stream lecture next Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern, and that will be on a topic you can vote for here exclusively on YouTube. I guess I'll do about 10 minutes of Q&A. And we had 2 really long Q&A sessions this weekend, so I'm kind of tired. But yeah, if you missed the nationalism thing, this will be available. You can go and watch it later on YouTube. In my opinion, pure democracy is just a fancy version of mob rule. It's the Constitution that keeps us on the rails. It's the idea that representative democracy, direct democracy is almost impossible to fully institute for all people. So you need some sort of representative system that can be created that doesn't necessarily make it a Republican government. Republican government is government where almost all legislation is made by representatives. America is originally a constitutional republic that eventually will morph and become more democratic as time goes on. So let me see. Let me look through the chat and see if I missed anything important. If you've got questions about these topics or about history or social studies in general, please drop them in the chat. Daniel was here. That's good. I talked about Voltaire. Yeah, the Americans industrialize rapidly. They basically borrow everything from the British. What is distributism? I don't know what that is. Is there an argument to be made that World War II really started in 1936 with the Sino-Japanese conflict? That's when I think it starts, and I also believe it's World War III. But I have some controversial opinions. Let me see here. Is Athens the place that best uses direct democracy? Yes. I would say so. I'm just looking through the chat. Why an L for Henry VIII and a W for Constantine? I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. Who created the Suez Canal? I did a video on this the other day. It was built by the French in an English colony that once belonged to the Ottomans, but was also partially ruled by the Egyptians. Gayahan asked about monogamy in the Roman Empire. As far as I know, monogamy was the rule, especially during periods of reform, like during Augustus's reign. But the depictions of orgiastic lifestyles in Rome, that is almost always, when you're looking at history of those things, when you're looking at the more juicy, sensationalized aspects, that is almost always a depiction of the upper classes, the upper crust, and the aristocracy doing their things. Napoleon wasn't that short, Noah. It was an exaggeration of British cartoonism at the time. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate your support. Christopher, I hope you enjoyed those burgers. Virginia was here, but she deleted her message. I don't know why. I don't know what BMPT 72 is. And there, I've caught up to the chat. I went all the way back. Why does the president get to start a war without the consent of Congress? The United States doesn't go to war anymore, it goes to military action. He is not supposed to technically start a war. He can authorize military actions, but he needs to have a quick and easy out of it. That is what the War Powers Clause basically says from the 1970s. And thank you so much, Tanya, for the super chat. Really appreciate it. I hope you have a great week too, Tanya. We appreciate your support for the channel. The super chats, all the money that goes into this channel, which is usually used for people to talk about a topic in depth, if they want me to give more than just a quick answer, or if they want me to talk about something I don't normally talk about, religion, politics, geopolitics. All of that money goes into making this channel as great as possible. Marriage was almost always monogamy. It was very common for all men to have mistresses. Mistresses were common, but again, this is something that would be more upper scale, something the rich could afford. Are there good examples of direct democracies around today? Not really. The last one was like in Poland, and that fell apart. So why would you say the founders were so eager to separate church from state? Is it mainly because Church of England couldn't be reconciled? What if England had remained Catholic? Would USA be Catholic? It would be Catholic. I think the Catholics have such a high tie to the Vatican and to the Pope that it would be harder for the Americans to get a separation of religious freedom if it had been originally a Catholic society. What is fascinating is that the separation of church and state in America allowed Catholicism to flourish in the United States far more than it had in Britain after the Protestant Reformation. You have the Catholic colony, you have strong Catholic presence, and you of course have the eventual immigration of Catholics from Italy and Poland in in Ireland especially, in huge numbers during the 19th century. Religious toleration, although not perfectly enacted by the Americans, is one of their biggest strengths. The ability to tolerate other religions, and the vast majority of the time, it has been other Christian denominations that are bickering with each other. You know, the differences amongst Protestant denominations nowadays, for most people in those denominations, are the matter of jokes and jeers and little debates. But a couple centuries ago, it was a matter of hellfire damnation for a lot of them. And Catholics and Protestants were even a bigger divide. Baptists and Methodists marry each other constantly nowadays. It wasn't something you would see commonly in colonial America. So religious divisionism, religious bigotry, religious divide was much sharper in the 1700s than it is now, and was far more pleasant than it had been 2 centuries before, when Protestants and Catholics were killing each other, and when the Protestants weren't killing Catholics, they were killing other Protestants. Are they going to, let me see here. Also, the Church of England has a lot of leeway within it, so it's very easy to get out of if you want to. Well, nowadays, the English don't really care. The Church of England is dying off and has very little influence. The monarch uses his power as the head of the Church of England for a lot of ceremonial pomp and circumstance. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the first time in history it's a woman, I forget her name, she's obviously extraordinarily influential. But the Church of England is not the entity it was in the 18th century, and that wasn't the entity it had been in the 16th century when it was persecuting offshoot Protestants like the Puritans. Were Chinese immigrants in the 19th century pressured to convert to Christianity? They were. I don't know how heavily, though. A lot of them were Buddhist, but there were Christian movements in China during the 19th century that were hoping to civilize China and make it more amenable to the West, and that's what the Dowager Empress struck out against during the Boxer Rebellion, was the influence of Christianity. Hudson Taylor, famous missionary over there. How did the U.S. Navy become so powerful after World War II? Heavy investments and subsidies from the government to actually produce a strong Navy. The Americans basically became the productivity capital of the world because of their productivity during the last World War. And that carried on afterwards when you're trying to build up to resist the Soviets and intimidate them. The British Empire starts to decline. Its Navy becomes secondary to the Americans. Yeah. If you ever swing more religious, then you should become Catholic. It's the ultimate contrarian opinion. See, that's very easy to say in the United States. That is not the case in Latin America. Where was Blackbeard born, and do we know his real name? Edward Teach is from England. I like studying the Catholic Church. I think it's a fascinating organization. I just don't believe what it preaches. And neither do most Catholics, by the way, Harry. Most Catholics don't care about Catholicism. And what I mean by that is, and that's probably going to get me in trouble, but what I mean is there's a huge amount of Catholics who are culturally Catholic who do not have very strong convictions about certain doctrines that the Church teaches. A lot of them believe in Jesus or believe in the saints. They know the distinctives, but especially in the United States where Protestantism is so dominant, they know the distinctives between Protestants and Catholics, where Catholics have a pope and a high regard of the Virgin Mary. Protestants don't have that as much, but they don't believe in some of the doctrines, transubstantiation or papal infallibility, these things that the Catholic Church teaches. What do you know about the gunpowder plot? It was an effort by Catholics in the government to blow up Parliament while the king was visiting there in 1605. There were different people behind it. The main engineer they were looking to was a man named Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was found out before the 5th of November. Remember the 5th of November. That's where that comes from, by the way, and was executed. Was the Anglican Church really just created so Henry could get a divorce? That's trite, and I think unfair to say that. That is what Catholics like to say to spite the Church of England. That's what secularists like to say to spite Christianity. There were many people within the Church of England which was Catholic, which wanted reform within the Church. The corruption of the Catholic Church in the 16th century was notoriously awful and had been lasting for quite some time. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man named Thomas Wolsey, who pimped for Henry VIII, who gave him Hampton Court, who was rich beyond his wildest dreams, is an example of the corruption within the Catholic Church. Wolsey, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury and England's Chancellor, one of the leading political figures, is probably the poster child of the simony and corruption that Martin Luther complained about in the Protestant Reformation. There were many who believed um, there needed to be proper reforms within the church. In fact, there had already been proto-Protestants called Lollards who had followed a man named John Wycliffe from the late 14th century for a century and a half. They'd been heavily persecuted by the established church in England. The Catholic Church was really, really in the weeds when it came to corruption, greed, scandal, uh, lack of proper doctrinal catechesis and teaching and things like this. And there were many people in England who believed there was a time and a need for reform. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, got Luther's ideas and loved them. A lot of people in the English government loved Lutheran reforms, Zwinglian reforms, and later Calvinism. Thomas Cranmer is probably the best example of this. And I think maybe more than anyone else, he's a fascinating individual. We don't talk enough about Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer is probably the English Reformation in a nutshell, whereas he's completely under the continual pressure of the political organization outside of him, be it Henry VIII, Edward VI, the young boy who has a regency of strong Protestants. Cranmer kind of blows with the wind for a while. He has the religious conviction of the Protestants. Anglicanism has all struggles within its first century to kind of define what it is, but it is not Catholicism, but it is not going to be hardline Calvinism, or maybe it will be under Edward VI after Henry VIII dies. Cranmer gets these ideas and he likes them. He writes the 39, I think he's the one who writes the 39 Articles of the Church of England. And then Mary I comes along. She tortures Cranmer and persecutes the Protestants heavily. Cranmer recants his Protestant views and then doubles down on them later. He had supposedly written his recantation with his right hand. When he is brought to be burned at the stake for being a Protestant heretic by Mary of England, he takes his right hand and he thrusts it into the fire so that he can't write his recantation first. It's a really cool story. But people like Miles Coverdale, William Tyndale, Hugh Latimer were all very, very convicted of their Protestant doctrines and heavily persecuted for that, because either the Catholics were on them, like Mary of the First, Henry's daughter, Bloody Mary, or because they didn't follow the Protestant teaching that the new Protestant church had. They were too extreme for that Protestant church. Tyndale translating the Bible into English was seen as a heavy crime, and Henry VIII believed it was only the church that could translate the scriptures, so he had him tortured and killed, and Tyndale's last words were supposedly, "God opened the eyes of the English king." So there was a soft opening to Protestantism in England, and there was a vacillation of what England would be during the Reformation, of how extreme it would get, and Cranmer being kind of jerked around and being inconsistent about it is kind of a story of how the Anglican Church, he is kind of a microcosm of how the Anglican Church emerges in England during the 16th century. It's a fascinating individual. It's a fascinating story. It's very, very complex and it's full of ideas, and that's why I love it so much. So in many ways, it's a long answer to a short question. But the Anglican Church, Henry VIII does get his divorce. He does get to seize the monasteries. He does get very wealthy. But there are many, many convicted Protestants who are very devoted to Protestant theology, either rejecting Catholic dogma, or even stronger Protestant dogmas like Calvinism or Lutheran dogmas. They're very convicted of it, and they are willing to fight and die for their faith, and they are willing to create a church in that image. Lucy Wooding's book goes into a lot of detail. There are many people who kind of drag their feet, though. There's a lot of Catholicism that continues to pepper and sprinkle itself into Anglicanism, and that's why Anglicanism today, of all Protestant denominations, is probably, and Episcopalianism in America, is probably closest to Catholicism, other than maybe the Lutherans. So it really wasn't for the sake of just a divorce. It was a firm commitment, but for Henry VIII it might have been. Henry VIII continued to practice the Latin Mass until his death. He was a Catholic in every sense, but he believed it, but he put himself in charge of the church. Then he didn't explain what the heck that meant. He made no major doctrinal changes, and then it was up to the people under him. It was up to Cranmer and his ilk to figure out what that looked like and how extreme that would be. That was the debate within Anglicanism throughout the rest of the 16th century. And it's eventually Elizabeth, Henry's last daughter, who takes over in 1558 after Mary died, who basically says that the Anglican Church will not be a Calvinistic church, but it will not be Catholic. It will have a more moderate approach. And she does this because of her own convictions being kind of moderate, but also because she realizes that this is probably the best way to to not rock the boat with a lot of Catholics still in the country. Catholics will be persecuted and will fight back in many instances, almost gaining a stranglehold under James II, which causes the Glorious Revolution I mentioned earlier in the 1680s. I mean, I could go on about this for years. It's an incredibly complex story. But Elizabeth creates the Book of Common Prayer. You know, that's where you get your classic wedding vows and things like that. With this ring I do thee wed. So it's not just because of a divorce. It's far more complex than that. Trying to write up Anglicanism because of that is not fair, nor does it appreciate the political and social circumstances by which the Church of England changed tremendously from a Catholic into a Protestant institution, which was a process, not an event, during the 1500s. Let me see here. True, most Catholics disagree with the Pope, even though the Catholic Church says the Pope is infallible. Most Catholics practice birth control. The Church officially teaches not to use birth control. It's one of the only churches that still refrains from using birth control. He always got an annulment. There are different things. Well, he basically said he was in charge of a church so he could do what he wanted. And he basically threw out annulments like they were divorces. I wish I could time travel and just live a simple life as a monk at a medieval monastery making illuminated manuscripts and drinking beer. Their lives were not simple. They were often very hard, and they had to work very hard. Menial labor and physically challenging labor was parcel of the existence of a monk. What kept Luther from being burned at the stake? Luther was able to ally, that's a great question too. Luther was able to ally himself with various different German principalities who were either convinced of his dogma or wanted to break away from the yoke of the Habsburgs in the Catholic Church and not pay so many taxes to the church, or both. And this allowed him to work with people like Frederick the Wise, who became his patron, who had him translate the Bible into German while hiding in his palace. Luther was able to kind of bob around Germany to different people who were able to basically sanction Protestantism and adopt Protestantism, and then try to force their people to be Protestant. How the Vatican operates is mind-boggling. It's so ridiculously complicated. Well, when you've been around that long, of course you're going to get convoluted and complicated. And finally, Hars is here. Did you ever play on Jeopardy? If you not, you should have. Well, thank you. I've signed up to play on Jeopardy. I watch Jeopardy every day. And I talk a lot about history. I don't know how I would do with, science or things like that. Where did the saying "something smells in Denmark" come from? Don't know. Oh, that's Hamlet. Shakespeare's writing. We're not going for 2 hours. I did do the 2 topics already, though, Hars. So we're in the Q&A portion of it. We are closing in on 2 hours. I said I'd only go 100 minutes. But I think corruption will always exist in some form within the Vatican, and corrupt backdoor dealings with cardinals and Italian mob of Pope Francis and now Pope Leo represent a true simple love of Jesus. Okay. If you read what Henry VIII actually thought till the day he died, he considered himself a loyal Catholic and he persecuted a lot of Protestants. Right. He just wanted to control the monasteries. He basically melted them down so that he could make a lot of money. What was the reason why Franco Bruno was burnt at the stake? I don't know who Franco Bruno was. He hated Protestants with a passion. He just did not accept the Pope that could overrule a royal decision. He barely reformed anything in how the Church operates or what it believes. The reforms were kind of a spectrum of reforms, beliefs, and jagged opinions that kind of bubbled and gurgled under the surface for 15 years until Henry died, and then his son and his regency was so adamantly Protestant, England would have ended up just like Calvin's reforms in Geneva. In fact, it's a series of reformers from England who go to Geneva, who take the ideas of Calvinism back, including John Knox, who founds the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. He would just want a church that would grant him sacraments at request, and so he wouldn't subject a foreign power that became a geopolitical pawn. Yes, Henry VIII was the Donald Trump of his day. Henry VIII is not a reformer. He was very Catholic. He was defensor fide. He wrote against Luther early in his life. It's fascinating. I blanked out there for a second. But yeah, it is fascinating to see the way Henry VIII develops. Nobody pings the Discord when the streams start. Yes, we should all... Well, Hars wasn't here when we started. When you realize it's Protestant work ethic and not Catholic grace ethic, I got banned from an Ever Chat once for making that joke. You're not going to get banned here. What did we delete? Praying to Mother Mary and them saints is weird. Why did we delete that? He has a right to say that. No, I get that, but he never got a divorce. He always got an annulment. Henry VIII did not believe in divorce. He was a Catholic. He did believe in annulments. Technicalities. It was the American Revolution, or at least the founding of America from a political perspective, and it was German nationalism. It's basically been political philosophy all day. I need some chapstick if you want to buy me some. I once had somebody, I had a video that went really viral, and somebody complained about my chapped lips in it, so I made a revenge video later that day explaining exactly how they invented chapstick. When you've got beautiful, rich, full babies like these, you get chapped all the time. Henry VIII was the Donald Trump of his day. It's hilarious. Going to have to remember that one. In many ways, he was this larger-than-life, aggressive figure, and Harry will hate it, but there's no doubt. Oh, you're not going to give me what I want. I'm going to go and get what I want in my own means. You don't respect me. You don't want to give me what I want. Well, then forget you and forget everyone else too. I'm going to go do what I want. Damn the expense. And whatever you think of Donald Trump, the larger-than-life figure that he cast is absolutely undeniable, whether that's good or bad. The energy created by people like him is what you see with Henry VIII. Henry VIII was a larger-than-life figure. And that could be extraordinarily inspiring, and it could also be extraordinarily deleterious. Look what happened to, Anne Boleyn. Can you explain the significance of the Mayflower Compact? It's one of the first governing documents in American history, and it basically sets up what the Pilgrims were looking for in establishing a Christian colony at Plymouth. How do you separate a Catholic priest from an altar boy? With a crowbar. Oh, dang, that one's bad. That one's terrible. We have lots of good Catholics on this channel who would not like that joke. It's funny, though. The Catholic Church, I will say this, it's a stereotype. It's obviously awful, the sex abuse history within the Catholic Church. You have 2,000 years of history, or however long they've been around, you're going to have a lot of examples of that. It is not ridiculously, disproportionately Catholic priests who abuse altar boys. Protestant ministers, Jewish rabbis, Muslim clerics do it as well in pretty much proportional numbers. It is not just a problem the Catholic Church has. The Catholic Church is so large that, of course, it has it on a larger scale. And comparatively, you're more likely as a child to be abused by a teacher than you are by a Catholic priest. But facts don't care about your feelings. Henry VIII was an autocrat, I agree, so it is Donald Trump, but Henry VIII did it in a time when it was normal to live like that. Donald Trump is not doing it in a time where it is normal. The copium has arrived, folks. This guy's going to condone it because it's white criminals. Yes, I condone everything that is evil that white people do. If you watched my live stream from yesterday, you would know that's absolute nonsense, and maybe you're just a troll, maybe you're just 12 years old and you just read a Reddit post so you think you know everything about how the world works, but you clearly don't know anything about history. I have said repeatedly that white people have done far more oppression, far more colonialism, far more imperialism, and far more evil than any other racial group. The reason why has nothing to do with them being white. It has everything to do with the technological abilities to go into different areas of the world and oppress people at such a great rate. And if the Chinese had gotten to the Americas before then, they would have done the exact same things. Let me see. The Constitution doesn't apply to Native Americans. The government broke too many treaties. That's why Native American reservations are like their own countries, baby baba. They actually don't necessarily follow the Constitution. Anyways, I'm going to sign off. We did almost get to 2 hours. But yeah, I mean, we had to end on that dark note with me talking about how bad white people are. Because, I mean, people are constantly either accusing me of being too left-wing or too right-wing about this topic. And I am going to say what I have said so many different times. I don't care about race when it comes to history. I don't think it's important. The reparations argument falls apart when you actually know your history, but I find it very strange that we want to focus overwhelmingly on evil things that white people have done, as if white people have a monopoly on it, which is just as racist as thinking that the Native Americans are savages who need to be enslaved, which is what white people thought when they first got here. So there was no salty history moments or arguments this stream. Let's end it on high note. That's true. There's no reason to be salty. I wasn't that salty yesterday. I was mad on Friday, but I thought I was fine yesterday. Do you agree with me, my line of thinking historically? A group of people spreads the most when they are isolated and breed up in different strengths and then spill out to neighbors. We can see this after the collapse of the Roman Empire. We can see this with immigration. Sure, why not? I don't really understand the argument. You're going to have to explain it more in detail. No, British and Americans owe reparations. Do the French owe the British reparations for the Norman conquest? Do the Germans owe the British reparations for the Anglo-Saxon conquest? What is America? What do you mean by America? The United States? Look at how many ethnic groups are in there. Do you really want to go down this rabbit hole? Do the English owe reparations to the French for the French Indian Wars? Which means that they both automatically owe each other. Do the Sioux owe we talked about Mount Rushmore yesterday. Do the Sioux owe reparations to the Pawnee, who they kicked out of that land because that land was sacred to the Sioux? Do the Apache and the Comanche owe reparations to the Hopi and to the other Indians that they brutalized in the southwestern part of the United States? And do the Americans owe reparations to the Mexicans for taking the southwestern part of the United States? Do the Spanish owe reparations to the Mexicans? Do the Mexicans owe reparations to the Native Americans that they tortured and killed in far worse ways than the Americans did? Look at how the Apache were treated in Mexico as how they were compared to how they were treated in Arizona. I'm sorry, but the reparations thing is a stupid argument because it becomes an infinite regress of oppression and evil by different groups of people that really makes no sense. Do the Mongolians owe reparations to almost all of Asia and Russia because of the Mongol horde? This tiny little country segmented between Russia and China owes no economic progress or power on a giant geopolitical state, owes reparations to the Russians, the largest nation in the world, because of the Mongols. Once you start down this road, there's really no way to go. Do the Japanese owe reparations for Nanjing? The Americans gave them reparations for the internment camps, but did they ever have the proper reparations for what they did at Nanjing? Do the Russians owe the Romanians reparations for what they did after the end of the last World War, which you don't know about, but I could tell you about, but you're not going to sleep for a few days. When you consider what the Russians actually did in Eastern Europe and the fact that they never paid any reparations to those people, it's absurd. We're dealing with free labor, pal. What you're saying is irrelevant in free labor, pal. Okay, do the Arabs owe reparations for the 1,300 years of Islamic enslavement and free labor they got out of the Africans? 1,300 years, pal. That's 13 times as long as American slavery lasted, but you only want to focus on America. If they owe reparations, then the Arabs owe tons of reparations. The Muslims owe reparations out the door. The Turks owe reparations for what they did to the Armenians. The Turks owe reparations for what they did to the Egyptians. The Turks owe reparations for what they did to the Arabs. We talked about this a little bit earlier. The Turks owe reparations to the Greeks. The Greeks owe reparations to everybody because of Alexander the Great. If you go down this route, why did we time him out? Why did we time him out? What he's saying is interesting. If we're going to go down this route of reparations, we're going to get very, very far down the line, and there's going to be a lot of nonsense. It makes no sense whatsoever, and the more I think about it, the more asinine it becomes, because the more history I can think of. Do the Russians owe the Ukrainians reparations for the Holodomor? And do the Ukrainians owe the Russians reparations for what Olga did to the people who killed her husband in Russia? The Slavic peoples who murdered her husband in the 10th century, the way she hunted them down and murdered them and their families. Okay, I'm going to answer these last couple of questions and then we're going to sign out. And I have to charge again. Thank you so much, Michael. Like the Middle East was peaceful and isolated because they just sat in the Middle East and didn't do much well. The Europeans did a lot. Now the Middle Easterners are impactful to the world because of the Europeans, yeah. And by the way, none of this is to glaze the Europeans. None of this is to excuse the evils of the Europeans. I'm able to hold two thoughts in my head that require context, require nuance. A politician, a clergyman, and a pimp walk into a bar. The bartender asks, "How can I help you, sir?" That's a good one. Scrap iron, thank you. If this is true, then I want reparations of Denmark, Italy, France, Norway, Germany, and so on and so on. Yep. The Canadians are owed reparations. The First Nations are owed reparations by the English, but what about the French? The Canadians are owed reparations by the French Canadians are owed reparations by the English, but do they then give those reparations to the First Nations? I don't understand any of this, and neither do you, Bubba, because it doesn't make any sense. You will only if you focus on one particular narrative does it make sense, and that narrative is true. Make no mistake, what the Europeans did to the Africans is absolutely awful. This isn't whataboutism. This is, if reparations go one way, they have to go all the ways. Otherwise, you are just simply targeting one group of people for their race and gifting to another group of people because of their race, which, by the way, that's called racism. In Rated R detail what the Russians did in Siberia? When? The Russians have done many things in Siberia. The conquest of Siberia in the 17th century is some of the most brutal warfare the Russians ever fought. There has to be one person on top. Pareto principle. Instead of focusing on reparations, we should be investing in ways to uplift all people and ensure good quality of life to all citizens. Well, I mean, that sounds nice on a Christmas card. That's an amazing punctuation to a Barack Obama, to an eloquent Obama speech. But how you do that and historical reality are two different things. The idea that we are now so enlightened that we are always acting on the best, with the best intentions for everybody else to help them, is completely asinine, and presidentism, which I think is a historical abomination. The idea that we've reached here, and the people in the past were selfish and always self-interested, but we're not self-interested. We're so self-interested, we're going to tell you we're not self-interested. Sounds pretty self-interested to me. Bubba doesn't care about any of those other crews. He only cares about, he only cares about his people. I have documentation. I have documentation of every single thing I just said. Every single example of reparations being owed is impossible. And if you really want to get into what the Africans have done in history, do the Egyptians owe the Sudanese because of Kush-Nubia? Do the Nubians owe reparation to them? What about what Ghana, Mali, and Songhai did in terms of enslavement and conquest in West Africa? Does Ghana owe reparations to Mali? What about these countries in Africa? It becomes so complex, it becomes impossible to actually determine. Do the Moroccans owe reparations to the Norsemen that they captured and enslaved? What Europeans did insofar as African slavery was wrong and is and should be widely condemned. It absolutely is. But I don't see any of the people who are demanding reparations condemning, saying that the Arabs owe reparations to anyone, or the Africans owe reparations to other Africans. It is always one way. It is never the other way. But and by the way, the millions of and they act like it's going to make a difference. Well, when the kleptocrats in Africa steal the millions of dollars of aid that's already given, normally by Western countries, nobody bats an eye at that. Nobody bats an eye at the kleptocracy. Oh yeah, just give more money to these people and their lives will be better. Really? Their lives are just as stupid, bad, and awful, and meaningless and stupid as they were when you came up with this stupid idea to give them the money in the first place. You've been doing it for a long time and you're just throwing money down the drain. Sorry, but you are. If New World European settlers made cities in previously uninhabited areas of North America, are they also indigenous technically? That's a big debate. America has a GDP per capita of $60,000 per person. Most Caribbean countries are around 10,000. Togo is about 1,500. Benin is about 2,000. The IQ rates, everything. Everything for people who ancestors, through despicable actions, were brought to these shores. Every single one of them, almost without exception, has a better life than the people that are in Africa. The Japanese owe reparations to China and Korea. Well, yeah, but what about the Chinese? They've invaded Korea. They've invaded Japan. Yeah. Let me see here. The reparations have already been paid in the form of opportunity and blessings of liberty and justice for all. That's also something. That's a nice right-wing statement, but again, it's ephemeral. Yes, the French owes Haiti. The French had the gall to force Haiti to pay them for the war to get their freedom. Unbelievable. How are the Haitians doing? And how is that the French's fault? The French owe them reparations? Do the Italians owe reparations for the Roman Empire? How far back does this go? Where is the standard? And is it only what white people have done to black people? Or dark-skinned people? Can it ever be what dark-skinned people did to white people, or to themselves? Or what white people did to each other? How long does this go back? What is the drawing line? And when will you stop being racist about it? Because that's what you're being. It's the only way you think about this is in terms of race. Yes, I do think that you can do reparations in in the time period when those people are alive, like the Japanese after the internment camps in America. Those people got reparations and they deserved it. So it's that makes absolute sense to give the freed blacks 40 acres and a mule would have been an excellent idea. I'm sorry it didn't happen, but I can't do anything about that now, and nobody should. That was direct reparation for direct mistreatment. It can happen that time, but I'm sorry, none of the people alive today in the United States have any experience directly with any of these things. So it's an asinine. It's an asinine idea. And the more I read about it, the more asinine it becomes. So it was not possible. Well, it could have been had Grant's administration worked out. And the Roman government owes the entirety of Christianity reparations for killing Jesus. Yes, the Italians owe the Vatican reparations. When you know how rich the Vatican is, it doesn't make any sense. I need you to keep stretching these streams out. I'd settle for 4 hours. Oh, like a Hassan Piker thing? Except I don't want to kill all of my opponents. Yeah, I mean, I could do that, but it's 2 hours. I went over 2 hours. I said I was only going to 10 minutes, but we went half an hour of Q&A. This is basically as long as the second live stream lecture was. I'm going to sign off. And we will be back Friday, 6 p.m. Eastern for Q&A. Check out all the long, short, and live form content available during the week. Please like and subscribe on your way out. We appreciate you guys joining us for a very, very good live stream with some good Q&A at the end. And we hope that you like and subscribe on your way out. Listen, I don't hate good people, just white people. But you must listen. I don't hate good people. I don't hate good, just white people. But you just must. Just this is about correcting a wrong. Okay then. Have fun. And just a reminder, you believe that a crazy black guy invented white people 6,000 years ago. So, I mean, I don't even know what to say about that. Yeah, I owe no one anything. But you should go subscribe to Harsonet's channel where he does U.S. history and edits of presidents. There you go. There's your reparations. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your evening. Yeah, check out all the content that's available. And we'll see you again another time. And as always, love history. Bye-bye now.